What's going on, guys? My name is Tim Ruswick, and today I wanted to talk about self-expression in art. But I don't want to talk about why most people go with that subject, specifically like how you can express yourself in art. Because I remember hearing stories from a lot of different people, GDC talks, and not even just games too, like different artists in art class in like high school and stuff, and just hearing people talk about how they were inspired to make this thing because of some childhood experience, or they wanted to make this thing because, you know, for their wedding proposal or whatever it was. And I always, for me, like art never really worked that way. Like I never said, okay, I've had this experience, I want to make a game about this. It's happened a few times, but more often than not, what ends up happening with me, and I don't know if this is, you know, this happens to other people as well, but I feel like when I make art, sometimes I just make things, and I don't really know why or what I'm doing, and I just end up making it, and I actually learn a little bit about myself because of what I made. And that seems almost like opposite of how I was always told that shit worked out. Like I had I did some poetry growing up, so I was in like a poetry competition that I won, and like my English teacher really pushed me to do that, and she would always encourage me to like write based on my experiences, but like I never really did that. I always wrote just whatever, and I didn't really have a rhyme or reason. Sometimes I wrote about random things, like seriously random things, like anything from like gorillas to dragons to like just I would just make up stories to try and tell a story. And same thing with like some of the fiction that I create. Like I've written short stories and all kinds of different things, and I've learned that like I should make the thing regardless of knowing whether or not why I'm making it, or what has inspired it. Because I feel like all of my life, everything that I've ever experienced in my life kind of inspires a little piece of it. And I can actually learn from the thing. I can learn a little bit about myself through the art, if that makes sense. So like with Philophobia, it was really, really interesting because you know, I thought I was maybe an emotionally healthy dude. I thought I was, you know, working on myself and improving myself and doing all this stuff. But, you know, a few years ago, here I was creating a game about a dude that gets broken up with and commits suicide, about being tortured in hell by these creatures, these demons of love. And, you know, the game was inspired by a breakup. That was when I started working on it, like a hard breakup. But I feel like I've learned more about myself playing the game, seeing what the game has become, rather than I did from trying to create something out of that experience, if that makes sense. Like it almost seems like to be a little bit of therapy and a little bit of like, you know, stuff that has kind of come out of my soul into this game. And I'm seeing it more and more, like the more that I complete it, the more the more emotion I put into it, the more emotion I try and trigger out of the player, the more I'm starting to learn things about myself that I never really knew. And it's really interesting because, again, it's like the opposite of mainstream knowledge, I guess. What I've always heard is like you experience something and then you know, get inspired and then you make art about that thing. And yeah, I've made a lot of stuff based on stuff that I love, right? Like I started working on a game called Black Rim, which was inspired by like FTL. You know, like I love that game, so I'm gonna make a game like it. I've done that plenty of times, but making a game like Philophobia, which is a big emotional investment, has really taught me a lot. It's really kind of showed me little pieces of myself. It's kind of like a doorway into my psyche, if that makes sense. And it's weird that I'm so emotionally tied to it, even though I feel like now, you know, like suicide is not something I would even consider. But back then, like, you know, I can't say I ever considered suicide, but like in the middle of depression. Maybe that was a thought in the back of my head. The emotional trauma and stuff that I went through, I'm sure, has a lot to do with it. I'm sure I talked a little bit about emotional abuse and going through situations where you feel powerless and stuff like that. I'm sure that has a lot to do with it. Like, the entire game doesn't have any combat, right? It was designed around the idea that you're supposed to feel powerless in hell with demonic hearts torturing you. That says a little something, right? Like, that's got to say something about me in a weird way. But I'm learning about myself through exploring my art, which I think is something people don't really do, or at least I don't hear them talk about it if they do. But I'm curious what your thought is on this. I'm curious if you've ever learned something about yourself through your own art. If you've ever, like, kind of made something and then learned a little bit about who you are or how you work in the world by creating that thing or by experiencing that creation, because it's something that I've kind of come to terms with lately. I used to think there had to be a reason, a very clear reason to do something. Like, I have to say, I was inspired by this. But it turns out, I make something and I kind of realize that after the fact. Like, maybe, like, a perfect example of this too is we made this little lunge monster. It starts off in this little, like, egg heart, and you go near it and then it crawls out of its little egg and chases you. And I was just kind of making it, I was coming up with ideas on stream as we go, and someone's like, hey, that looks kind of like Alien. That little, the face hugger from Alien. And I was like, you know what? Alien's one of my favorite movies. Probably has a big influence on that. I didn't think that. I wasn't consciously designing it as that. But you know what? It's probably a big part of it. And I think the same thing comes from, like, all the emotional stuff, all the stuff that I've been through, all the experiences, the stories that I want to tell, all the dark feelings that I want to kind of help the person going through this experience kind of conquer. And the story is about empowerment. It is about, you're living in this powerless world, but you somehow manage to succeed. And sometimes we all feel that way about life. Sometimes we feel like life is happening to us, and art, I feel like, is a way of expressing those feelings, but you don't necessarily have to know that you're expressing those feelings. Sometimes they can just come out in the things that you create. And I want to know your thoughts. I want to know if you've ever done this, the backwards way, where you create something and you learn something about yourself. So if you have, please leave me a comment below. Tell me your story. I would love to hear it. If you have any questions about any of this stuff, let me know that as well. Once again, I'm Tim Rustwick, and I will see you again tomorrow.